Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to an FS Club webinar. But this one is being done very much in conjunction with Finance Suisse and the embassy here in London, the Swiss embassy here in London. And we're absolutely delighted to have an excellent panel today. We have His Excellency the Ambassador Alexandre Fasel, Claudia Bolli, who is Head of Responsible Investing at Swiss Re Group Asset Management. We have Sabine Döbeli, who's the CEO of Swiss Sustainable Finance, and our very own Dr. Ben Caldecott, the founding director of the Oxford Sustainable Finance Program. So it should be a very exciting session today. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is my privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars that we've been hosting during this pandemic. And I can only do so thanks to the tolerance, if I dare say it, of our sponsors who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And we're absolutely delighted today to have a special sponsor in the form of the Swiss Finance. Today's agenda is a rich one. My job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible and let you hear from our experts. We're going with some remarks from His Excellency. I'll be providing a tiny bit of context from the Global Green Finance Index. We have two presentations, one by Sabine, one by Claudia, and then some comments from Ben. And then we're very, very much counting on your questions, comments, and answers to many of the things we're posing today, which is really, what is the role of financial centers in fighting climate change? Three items, if I may. One, the slides will be up. In fact, are already up and posted and available to you. Two, there is a recording being made, and that recording will be available in approximately 2 working days. So hopefully will be posted either late tomorrow or Monday morning. And finally, to put your comments and questions in, please do type them into the GoToWebinar question facility. I'm here with you, and I'll feed those into the conversation, but I won't be checking Signal or WhatsApp or my emails or messaging. So please do feed them in. All of your questions and comments will be sent to all of our panelists. So if you want to contact somebody directly, just say you'd like to be in touch with them or anything of that nature, and they can get back to you because your email will be attached to it. So with no further ado, if I may, Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Bonjour et bienvenue à tout le monde. Welcome to today's seminar. Can I start by thanking Zien and its Financial Services Club for co-organizing this event together with us and Swiss Finance, and Professor Michael Mainelli, the Executive Chair of the Zien Group, will moderate and expertly guide our discussions today. Thank you, Michael, for that, and thank you for co-organizing it with us. I'm delighted that we have been able to get some of the leading actors from the UK and Switzerland to share their views on today's fascinating topic. This event is part of the Embassy event series called A Swiss-UK Dialogue, where we shine a spotlight on topics of mutual interest to our two countries. These exchanges, particularly around financial policy, have taken place for many years and are successful thanks to a mutual understanding and openness around financial questions. Before I turn to the substance of today's webinar, please allow me to draw your attention to the finance.swiss logo on the invitation. This is a newly launched Swiss finance online portal that brings together the latest information on the Swiss Financial Center in one place, primarily for an international audience. This platform is part of the Swiss federal government's policy for an internationally competitive financial center as a key pillar, and is also a key pillar of Switzerland's communication strategy abroad. So please look it up, have a look at this new platform. Now, speaking of sustainable finance, Switzerland aims to be a leading location for sustainable financial services. And it seems that we are on the right track, with top rankings for Zurich, which is second, Geneva, which is seventh, in the latest Global Green Finance Index. and Michael will later present these findings in more detail. Sustainability presents a considerable opportunity for the Swiss Financial Center. The government primarily acts as a facilitator in this context, cultivating an intensive dialogue with the financial industry and supporting the creation of optimal regulatory framework. We want to support the competitiveness of Switzerland's financial center, but at the same time, take the necessary steps towards greater sustainability. Financial centers that want to remain successful in the long term must be stable, trustworthy, and sustainable. Sustainability in the financial sector needs to be underpinned by credible climate change policies. And in 2019, the Federal Council, that's how we call our federal cabinet, the national government, the Federal Council set the objective of zero net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We look forward to COP26 in Glasgow later this year, where Switzerland will, of course, actively contribute to a positive outcomes. What are the steps we have already undertaken in that domain? So in 2020, the Federal Council adopted a report and guidelines on sustainability in the financial sector. And at the beginning of this year, Switzerland officially became a supporter of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. The Federal Council called on Swiss companies from all sectors of the economy to implement these recommendations on a voluntary basis from now on. And it also announced work towards making the recommendations binding. Speaking of carbon pricing, that of course is a key instrument to align financial markets. Switzerland has, with 96 Swiss francs, which is approximately 76 pounds, has the highest levy per ton globally. And the revised CO2 law we are bringing in will allow levies to more than double, up to 166 pounds. Last but not least, let me mention green fintech. The future of finance is digital and green, and the combination of sustainable finance services, financial services, and digital technology is particularly promising. Switzerland aims to become a global hub for green digital finance. To achieve this vision, this Green Fintech Network, the Green Fintech Network, a joint initiative by the Swiss government and the private sector, launched in November last year, recently published an action plan focusing on 16 distinct areas. A facilitated access to sustainable data is one of the potential measures put forward. And the action plan also provides promising opportunities to deepen the Swiss-UK bilateral cooperation in the area of financial services. So I think all that is a good segue to our UK-Swiss dialogue event today. And I'll stop here. Please stay tuned, enjoy the conversation. Please also connect with us on social media, in particular on Twitter and the Swiss Embassy UK account. And with that, au travail, and I hand the floor back to Professor Mainelli. Merci, Michael.
Ambassador, merci and vielen Dank. That was absolutely excellent and a really interesting warm-up. Folks, Peter has put into the chat room a link there to the Finance Suisse initiative on green, so please do feel free to check that out. I'll now move on, if I may, to the next section, which is just a quick review of the Global Green Finance Index to set a bit of context here. I intend to be very brief, and again, Peter will be placing into the chat room a link to the Green Finance Index if you want more detail. The Global Green Finance Index has now in its 7th edition, has been tracking global financial centers and how they're doing in the road to net zero, amongst other things. Over the 7 editions, what we've seen is that green finance continues to grow in popularity, and the ratings of green financial centers have risen both for nearly all centers in both depth and quality. But what we are seeing are a couple of items. The first is, interestingly, policy matters, not just in finance, but where a city is actually showing leadership in water, clean air, public transport, and livability, green finance equally benefits from that. So it's kind of, walk the talk or live the life properly. Of course, Switzerland, as somebody who used to live in Geneva, scores very, very highly on quality of life and attention to the environment for many years, not just on climate change and other issues. But there is no room for complacency at the top. The Asia Pacific has been catching up with European centers. In the very first few editions of the Green Finance Index, one could have said that green finance was a European affectation. But what we're seeing is compression and a general rise at the very top, and a lot of competitiveness there. When we turn and look at the top 10 centers, what I think stands out quite remarkably, though, is the strength of Switzerland in both of these areas. So both Zurich and Geneva have performed phenomenally when one considers the size of the country. And in fact, we here in the UK are looking for a dialogue with other centres about green finance and how to improve it. It's very clear that we have quite a bit to learn from Zurich and Geneva. The other thing I might like to point out, though, is that the competition is a rich one. An index like this suffers sometimes from providing a single index number, and people say that I'm a point or two ahead of you, or you're a point or two ahead of me. That may sound interesting, but the truth is it's a rich area. And so when we look in more depth at where Geneva and Zurich score by instrumental factor group, we see some interesting differences here, with Zurich scoring high on sustainability issues and business and human capital and infrastructure, but Geneva having a slightly richer bit, seeming to be a good business zone, but weaker in the other three instrumental factor areas. And something that I'm sure we can explore a little bit here, and in my personal opinion, somewhat due to Geneva's strength, oddly, as a commodity trading center. When we look just a little bit further at what's on practitioners' minds, a number of people have remarked over the years, myself included, that I do wish that in some way green finance would disappear. It ought to be normal finance. And it's quite clear from this slide, when we look at what's driving green finance and people who are working in the sector, they're spending a lot of time and attention on the climate change debate, and also on trying to influence the structure of policy and regulatory frameworks. And this is not quite what you would see in many other areas of finance. And it just shows the heavy dependence on public policy. And so initiatives, as the ambassador mentioned, to really keep the price of carbon high are typically things that will result in practitioners beginning to realize that this is for real, and they can then begin to treat things with less attention to policy changes and direction. Now, just before we hand over to the first of our presenters, we have a quick quiz for you, just to get your minds in action. And I'm about to launch a poll here, which is going to say, if you were in charge, which one of the following do you believe would most accelerate green finance growth in any country? So I'm handing over to an audience full of FS Club people who normally answer these things very rapidly, just warning our respondents, our participants, that they can be quite quick off the ball. We're now up to half of the audience having voted. I'll leave the poll open for just a little bit longer to get us up onto 3/4 of the audience. Okay. Just about to close that poll then, and I'll be sharing those results with everyone. Well, it seems here that there's a fairly even spread. Carbon price high, and so very interesting to hear the ambassador's emphasis on this, with which I would concur. Next down would be tax incentives. In third place, policy and regulatory frameworks, and in fourth place, ESG reporting. But quite interestingly, not any particular interest in a government green investment bank. Well, it's at this point that we turn now to our panelists. So thank you, audience. And on the panelists, our first speaker today is Sabine Döbeli, chatting to us as the CEO of Swiss Sustainable Finance and dialing in from Zurich. So Sabine, the floor is very much yours.
Thank you, Michael, for these introductory words, for the insights also about the Global Green Finance Index. And I'm very pleased to be here today as part of this webinar, providing you some insights of how we drove this development to a green and sustainable financial center forward in Switzerland. And if I look back at how it came about, I have to say, in my view, it largely depends on effective cooperation. At least that's the experience we had in Switzerland. Looking back a few decades even, I have to say, at first, sustainable finance was mainly driven by market players. Over 30 years ago, the first services in sustainable finance were established. We saw a lot of market players bringing innovative products to the market, although I have to say demand from the client side was rather reserved back then, especially from the Swiss institutional side. That took quite a while to actually pick up. But then in 2014, some of these market players teamed up and founded Swiss Sustainable Finance as the Swiss association promoting sustainability in the Swiss financial center. And what we did in these last 7 years was really driving this development through informing about best practice, through the development of standards and tools, but also fostering cooperation was also always one of our key objectives. And for quite some years now, this coalition of the willing, which started with the support of around 60 organizations and has now grown to about 170, we were for a long time the only ones driving this. Now, this has massively changed in the past 1 to 2 years. And if you go to the next slide, you see how this picture has changed. And what we saw happening in the past 1 to 2 years is really that the mainstream came in. And this development is now driven by a lot of different organizations and the government. I should start with the activities of the government. Ambassador Fasel mentioned it already. We have the State Secretariat for International Finance that has coordinated work on policy work on sustainable finance in the past 2 years, thereby also building on a work group with private sector representatives. And the result was the mentioned report published last June, and then the actual measures such as TCFD reporting, also mentioned by Ambassador Fasel, and some other requirements that are now put into place. They currently also work on measures to provide more clarity on the definitions of sustainable finance, definitely also fueled by the development we see in the European Union with SFDR. We are getting our heads around how this should be taken up in Switzerland and how we can provide more clarity to investors. But what has also happened in the past year and a half is that the mainstream finance associations came into play. Swiss Banking last summer published a guide on how to integrate sustainability and climate issues into client advisory. Swiss Sustainable Finance, jointly with the Asset Management Association, prepared a guidance document, some recommendations on how to design a sustainable asset management process, and it really refers to all the different elements of asset management. And the Swiss Insurance Association, also one of the 3 large finance associations in Switzerland, prepared a first report on the state of play with regards to sustainability and the insurance business, and set up a work group to dive deeper. But what I would also like to mention is the key role of universities. And especially University of Zurich and University of Geneva have been instrumental in bringing the topic forward. They do research on this subject, but they also have had a various amount of courses in place to train practitioners. One thing that I would like to mention is the new master program of the University of Zurich on sustainable investing. But something that I also find quite novel is their work that they do with wealthy individuals and representatives of family offices on how these people can use their wealth for impact in the real world. I think that's quite innovative. We then had some large government-affiliated pension funds that founded SVVK, which is an organization doing engagement for these large pension funds, also taking climate change into account as a key engagement topic, of course. And last but not least, I would like to mention building bridges. which was a joint initiative of Sustainable Finance Geneva, of us, SSF, and also Genève Place Financière, with the objective of establishing a large conference, but also a movement to foster SDG investing. Based in Geneva, because there we have the proximity to international organizations that are active in this field. And as the name states, it's really the objective to build bridges between these international organizations and finance in Switzerland. You see, a lot has happened in the past 1 to 2 years, and not without effect. If we do move to the next slide, you see how sustainable investments have developed in Switzerland based on the results of our market study. It was already published last June. We then identified a plus of 62% in sustainable investments managed in Switzerland, both from asset managers and banks, but also from asset owners. And what you see here is really this mainstreaming effect. More and more banks and asset owners are integrating ESG broadly into their asset management. And you will probably be interested to see how it will again have developed in last year. We will present these results on 7th of June. You might want to check out our website for the respective webinar. I think the next job we have to do is come to clearer definitions and also differentiate a bit between just purely mainstream ESG integration and true sustainable investments with a proper impact on the real economy as well. That's where I see the next challenge for us as well. So with this, I finish, and of course, I'm happy to answer any questions of the audience or also of you, Michael. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Sabine. And I think you're being quite modest. I've often pointed to some of the very deep thinking on green finance in Switzerland. I recall over a decade ago, Bank Saracen trying to point out to all of us the sensitivity of sovereign bond weightings to various environmental stresses. So it's certainly been a long road in it, and it's one that you're succeeding at. Anyway, we'll turn now, if we can, to Claudia, who's going to present a vision from one of the practitioners and certainly one of the very leading insurance firms in the world, Swiss Re. Claudia, the floor is very much yours.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And also thank you very much to you as well as to the ambassadors. Very kind invitation. So it's a great pleasure to be here. When I received the invitation, I also got the question right, what we consider as relevant to enable the transition towards a net zero global economy. And what you see on the slide is ultimately what we consider in a very nutshell. Happy to outline a little bit. But maybe before setting a little bit the starting point, as you, or many of you have probably heard, right, in the last 1.5 years, we have seen some amazing developments. Just as an example, the historic commitments from the EU or China with regard to net zero emissions. We have also seen, right, the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. Also announcing great ambitions in that regard. And just in front of us lies the COP26 in Glasgow, where we can expect more rights that will boost the race to zero. However, what we always say at Swiss Re, right, we need to act now and we need to act decisively. So, and one of the drivers we see or we consider why we should do so is also outlined in a new publication from the Swiss Re Institute, where we put a cost at what it means when temperature rises. So we calculated that if we do not tackle climate change, it will have an impact on the global GDP by 14%. And I think that is a strong motivation to act. The question is now, what is needed that we all can collaboratively move forward? Because I think it's not either the financial market or the policymakers or regulators or whoever who should do it. I think it is a collaborative approach, because ultimately We are all impacted. It's not just a topic which is relevant for one player. So what you see here is we think transparency and disclosure is one piece. Another piece is investable solution. And the last one, as already highlighted a little bit, the collaborative actions. And I'm happy to a certain extent to have seen that you voted that some of these pieces are also relevant from your perspective. Why do we come up with transparency and disclosure? Our experience is, right, that we can just move forward if we set targets. With targets, you're in the position to measure, you're in the position to define specific actions, and you can measure yourself against it. And as such, the question is, how do you set these targets? Of course, you need to do analytics, you need to investigate. And for that, you need the data. If you do not have solid data, how can you properly investigate? How can you properly set targets? So in that way, for us, it is key to get this data. And that means ultimately that we would very much appreciate if companies, and not only financial market players, but the real economy starts reporting about climate data. And with that, it is possible for us as the companies, the financial market players stand one level behind, right, to then report on their investments doing into that real economy. We think, and I'm very happy having heard that from our ambassador, right, and that Switzerland is part now of the TCFD. Swiss Re is also part of the TCFD, of this working group, and we report since 2016 on that. We have made good experience because it gives you a pragmatic approach. It helps you to really investigate your investments. So it pays not only out for the stakeholders you report to, it also pays out for yourself going through that exercise. As such, we think such a global framework helps. It also helps as it is global, because with that you increase comparability, right? Going back to getting the data and analyze it. If you have it from different areas and it's not following the same standard, it is challenging to use them and make consistent analysis, because first you need to transform them into the same world of thinking, let's say it as that. So that's a little bit the reason why we promote disclosure and transparency. Why do we promote or appreciate attractive and investable solutions? We have seen in the market there are solutions available, but what we also experience usually is, as climate change specifically became a trending topic, there is a certain run for such investments. That means currently demand is higher than supply. That has a price impact, right? And ultimately, if the demand is higher than the supply, it also means there is room for more projects. There is room for financing more green ideas, innovation, and so on. However, what we also experienced is, as an insurance company who needs to follow also just traditional regulations as Solvency II as an example, we are limited with how far we can go when it comes to investments. And as such, we very much appreciate if an investment has a risk return profile, which we call at market rates. So that means the risk return profile is comparable to a traditional investment, because otherwise we are usually hindered by certain regulations to go into these investments. So in that way, we hope, of course, as well, or we think, of course, as well, that the regulation should be set in the way that it enables the financing of such innovative solutions. What is also helpful, we think, is having global frameworks which could be attached to these investable solutions. So which helps the investor who goes into these investments to identify how green such an investment is. Also there, as a global company, right, and who is investing in various regions, we favor we favor global frameworks, because with that it makes it more to go into the various markets, to compare them, and also we do not need to create separate reportings for each and every region, which might even confuse investors who want to invest in our company and say, how sustainable does Swiss Re business, right? So it's also making sure we can serve our stakeholders in a good way. And then as a last point, as already mentioned, collective actions. I stated earlier, right? It's not, climate change is not a problem, or not only a problem of the financial market. It's not only a problem of investors. It's a global problem, and people are impacted. It's not some specific group will be impacted. We all will be impacted, and as such, we need to find solutions which work for everybody and which work globally, because climate change also doesn't know borders or regions or whatever, right? So in that way, if we can tackle that challenge globally, I think we all win. With that, maybe quickly move to the next slide if we still have a few minutes time. I outlined a little bit, right, what is needed with regard to the financial markets, or what we see as the pressing needs. However, what we also see where the obligation lies with the companies, right, they need to bring something to the table as well. And how we see this, we need to set targets, we need to take actions, we need to measure, and we need to report. As outlined at the beginning, without the targets, we will never be able to take the actions, because we do not have a goal we want to achieve. And the measurement ensures we are on track, and the reporting helps our stakeholders to understand what we do, how we do, and why we do. With that, I stop here. Would like to hand over back to Professor Mainelli. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Claudia. And we're going to move into our panel discussion. So could I ask Sabine and Ben to please join us? Ben, just before I hand over to you for some comments on what you've heard and we move into the discussion, we do have a lot of questions here. And I'd just like to open with one, which I think might set your comments in context. Alderman Alison Gowman, who is here in the City of London and also one of the directors of the Green Finance Institute, is asking, what one thing can the UK really learn from the Swiss model to accelerate green finance?
Gosh, is that for me, Michael?
I think so, Ben.
God, wow. Well, that's a really tough question. I mean, I think, before I try and answer it, firstly, thank you for the invitation, and I want to thank the Swiss Embassy also for co-organizing the event. I think the thing when you look around the world, I'm going to broaden it out slightly, is jurisdictions that succeed in this tend to be ones that have multiple things happening simultaneously, right? There's not one silver bullet. It's actually the fact that you're trying to sustain a vibrant ecosystem, and that entails, one, having a policy frameworks in place, supervisors that support this agenda. You have to have research institutes and academics working on data and the science, because so much of this is about measurement. You need to have NGOs and civil society providing accountability, influencing government, shaping policy. So you kind of need all of these things, and there aren't that many places in the world that have all of these things together, operating together to create that self-sustaining community that can drive forward innovation. And I think we have that in the UK. We certainly have that in Switzerland. And I think it's wonderful that we're starting to explore these opportunities to collaborate between these two very important global financial centers. Because if you're going to try and change the global financial system, and transform the real economy in the space of 20 to 30 years, we're going to have to move very quickly, and we're going to have to insert into financial practices around the world best practice. And where do you do that? Well, you do that in the largest, most international financial centers. You do that in the UK, you do that in Switzerland, and others will copy. And that has to be a central part of the strategy for greening finance.
Sabine, it's interesting. We have Hugo Innes dialing in from Barbados, and he remembers attending a conference with you, a Sustainable Swiss Finance Conference in Geneva, when the head of the Norwegian pension fund predicted this rise of sustainable investments, as his fund was making a major market signal by no longer investing in fossil fuels. And he congratulates you. It's amazing to see this 10 times growth of sustainable investment. But do you have any insights or takeaways for the UK in achieving that type of rise?
Well, maybe without wanting to put our results down, we have to also put it into proportion. What we see here is not all completely climate compatible investments. And I expect that there will be quite an intense discussion in Switzerland as well around the actual sustainability quality of these assets. What we did in the last report for the first time is that we looked more deeply into the combinations of approaches that were applied to these volumes. We look at 8 different approaches ranging from exclusions to ESG integration to the more active strategies such as voting and engagement, all the way to thematic and impact investing. And we found that a large majority of these assets actually applied more than one approach, combined 2, 3, maybe even 4 approaches. And I think that's an important way forward when we talk about quality. But maybe to put it into proportion, not all of these are fully sustainable investments already. So coming back to the question, how do you actually initiate such a development, or how do you further grow sustainable investments? I think it's a step-by-step process. You have to get investors on board for them to start with at least one approach, let's say ESG integration. And then through client demand, through technical discussions as well in circles such as Swiss Sustainable Finance, they will move up the ladder slowly. They will take other approaches on board. They will make these investments more sophisticated. So I really see it as a gradual development. But maybe Claudia can also speak about her experience. I mean, she did the process at Swiss Re, and I guess you didn't start with the level you're at now. So maybe you give us some insights there. Sorry, Michael, if I pass it on.
I think it's a very interesting question, and when you raised it, I was thinking, what makes really the difference? And I would say one thing is the integration in the company, and for that you need to have commitment from top down, right? You need to have someone who says, this is important for the company and we want to drive this forward, and that completely changes the activity. That's one piece. However, how does the message come to someone who can start promoting in a company? And I think there Switzerland probably has a certain benefit because it is small. And small means the people in the sustainability space, they know each other. We see each other on a regular basis, planned and unplanned, because we just cross our paths on webinars, before COVID, it was even more different, right? You really went to an event and you saw the same crowd, and maybe you went every second week to an event and you see this crowd every second week. That means you start exchanging, you start discussing where you have identified challenges and hurdles, and you start asking the other, how did you overcome that? Can we do something together to overcome that? And I think it's this very natural exchange, the willingness to share, the openness to share, and also the willingness to achieve something. And when you have then the people together on such a regular basis, I have the impression it's much easier to really kickstart something. and to move to the next step. I mean, just to give you an example, Sabine mentioned earlier the SSF, that the SSF is working on pieces, but also the SVV did this report. And the first year, there was not a lot of exchange, but already this year, right, we started to exchange. How can we collaborate with maybe even bringing the reports together, right? And bringing the companies who report under the SVV, the insurance association, sorry, to make sure that they report under the Sustainable Finance Hub. And I think that's the way how things can happen, that you really initiate, that you start sharing, talking and collaborating, and the willingness of taking action.
Great. Shifting ground just slightly, probably for you, Ben, Richard Parler points out that climate change and biodiversity are inextricably linked, but that on the scale that I showed, climate change is high on practitioners' minds and biodiversity is not. We've had the Disgupta review on biodiversity here in the UK, and in fact, Partha will be on an FS Club webinar later this month. But Richard would like to ask, what can be done to raise awareness of the importance of the loss of biodiversity amongst practitioners?
Sorry, I muted myself. Super important question, really, really critically important. And there are two aspects to this, right? So one is, how should financial institutions be measuring nature-related financial risks in their portfolios and loan books? And how do we raise the awareness of materiality? Because these things are material for many investments, for many sectors of the global economy. And that's why, for example, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, this process that was kicked off by the UK and Switzerland a couple of years ago, well, less than a couple of years ago, is really important. And hopefully that gets momentum. And we can talk more about the data and the analytics and what disclosure can do and what it can't do. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is we need to create investable and bankable opportunities for nature-based solutions. And this is existential, I think, actually. We need to be able to pay for and finance the protection and restoration of natural capital around the world at huge scale. And at the moment, we can barely get money from A to B, from people that support this stuff into projects that can actually make a difference. We need to transform that in the next 5 to 10 years. And if we don't, we will have lost a huge amount of natural capital forever, and it will have all sorts of negative implications, including making climate change much, much worse. So I think this is an existential challenge where finance, investment, policymakers, regulators can work together to create actually what will be a massive investment opportunity. But we're going to have to innovate very quickly, and we're going to have to learn and deploy lessons that we have learned from other areas where we have seen success. And I'm thinking in particular renewables, for example. We have figured out how to get money from A to B. We have figured out how to create investable, bankable frameworks to deploy renewable technology. We need to learn from that and scale that up very quickly for nature-based solutions.
Okay. I think this question might be for you, Sabine. It's from Christopher Gleedle. He's really curious about how much can climate-related disclosure be trusted. In a recent CDP report, it was stated that 74% of asset managers don't identify market risks such as financial asset price devaluation as the economy transitions to net zero. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, how can the data be trusted? I think we still have a path to go there. But frankly, with TCFD becoming a lot more popular now, companies learning how to report, and there will be more discussions about how to create comparable KPIs that investors can really rely on. I clearly think there will be massive improvement in the next 1 to 2, 3 years ahead. The other question, seeing that not a lot of investors already take it into account in their models. Yes, it mightn't fully be reflected in prices, but I also see changes coming along here with more data being available, with data being more reliable. I'm sure there will be pickup by financial analysts to do that in a more formal way, to do it in a more structured way, and it will evolve over time. That's really all I can say. I mean, we can't mandate them to do so, but I clearly see an improvement.
Stephanie Rochford here in London is curious about your views, Claudia. Are there specific global reporting frameworks that Swiss Re is using currently, or which they would want to see adapted in order to factor in ratings that help to inform investors? And do you have a view on the EU's new corporate sustainability reporting directive, and how does Swiss Re intend to engage with that?
Thank you very much for the question. So, yeah, as mentioned before, right, we favor very much global standards, as we are a global company, and what we see at the moment is more local, regional guidance and frameworks develop, right? We have, you just mentioned the EU one. Malaysia, as an example, is coming up with some green bond guidance. We also have Singapore with some guidelines and frameworks. I'm sure we also will see soon something from the US, and that is for us a little bit a situation we fear, right, from several reasons. It will be much more complex to report on this. I also think a little bit about, you know, ultimately we will then start reporting one piece in different ways. So means depending on which region you are, you will look on this piece either from the left-hand side, from top, from the right-hand side, from whatever. And depending on from which side you look at it, you will get different information and you get a different understanding or perception of what it is. So I think global frameworks ultimately give us all a common language. So means if someone who sits in Asia will communicate with someone from Europe, and we have this global framework, we talk about the same thing, which makes the whole collaboration much smoother, much more efficient. And in that way, I'm convinced we will achieve the goals faster and in a better way. So having global frameworks is for me the common language. We think TCFD, as an example, we gained now several years of experience with TCFD. We think it's a great framework because it also goes into the risk perspective, because ultimately, let's say it that way, the doing good approach is more a value-based approach. Am I in the position to tell someone else what his value should be? No, I'm not. However, on the risk, we all can have a kind of a similar view, right? As we do already in the traditional financial market. We all have a view on a corporate bond with a AAA versus a BB. How risky is one to the other? And I think to that point, we should come. And I think TCFD is a document or a framework that helps us, enables us, as it has this risk view. You asked me about the EU. I was part of the technical expert group, so I'm a little bit biased, I must say. I think the ultimate aspiration is the right one. The question is, how do you get there? And what I have seen is ultimately they start with bits and pieces on a standalone basis. And these bits and pieces should ultimately then come to one big framework. And I think it's tricky if you start working on the bits and pieces on a standalone basis, and afterwards say they need to fit together. It's like you create the puzzle pieces, but without checking do the puzzle pieces fit into each other. And I think that is currently a little bit the situation for some investors, that they experience it is challenging when they want to integrate the EU framework, that the pieces do not smoothly fit together, or if they make it fit together, it's a big thing, right? And it's very complex. And I think there is room for improvement, right? That the market picks something up. The market needs to see the use and the meaning. If you come from a risk side or from a side that this will cost you money, they will quickly pick that up, and that I think is not yet very obvious with that specific approach. So tilting it a little bit more in that direction would be great, and making it that the puzzle pieces fit a little bit smoother together, I would see as another opportunity.
We've got an audience very interested in a lot of things, and I might point out Greg Davies, who works in the CRE market, says that biodiversity ranks lowly in the KPIs organizations employ, with carbon, health and safety, waste, well-being all much more highly, reflecting the demands that are being placed on businesses. Richard Burge is curious about some of the perverse incentives as we go for net zero at the expense of other natural assets rather than perhaps gross zero. But in the time available, and knowing the three of you have got a great interest in COP26, there's a question here from Stephanie Glover. Beyond renewed commitments and targets by individual nations, is there anything specific, say, on the green finance agenda that you would like to see happen as a result of COP26? And I might turn to Ben and then Sabine.
Sure, great question, and lots of things, obviously. I mean, I think one thing that I'll mention though is, the importance, the criticality of non-state actors, including financial institutions, in the COP processes now. It's not just about countries ratcheting up nationally determined contributions, which they do every 5 years or 6 years in this case because of COVID, and of course that's very, very important. But we need financial institutions, we need companies also to make commitments to essentially make equivalents of nationally determined contributions, transition plans and targets, and to ratchet them up periodically, and for those targets and those commitments to be accountable ones. They can't just rock up at a summit, make some promises that are completely inconsistent and unmeasurable, get a bit of press coverage and then bugger off. That we need to formalize this much more for non-state actors, and you're seeing steps to do that, of course, including through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero that was launched on the 23rd of April. To try and get those commitments, to make sure that there's a framework that can hold them to account, ratchet them, and this is something that's going to be going on for a long time, right? This is a 25-30 year journey, and we're just starting to put the architecture in place, but that's very important. But we've got to then turn that into more ambitious commitments that are actually delivered on the ground to achieve change in the real world.
Sabine, any thoughts?
Well, I can only follow up on what Ben said, and of course he's instrumental in getting the finance industry involved and getting them to make clearer commitments ahead of COP26. So thank you, Ben, for your engagement on this. And we are in dialogue with you and try to promote this in Switzerland as well, and we'll reach out to our members to look for more finance organizations in Switzerland, both asset managers and asset owners, to make clear commitments to align their financial flows to the Paris goals. But as you mentioned, Ben, not just as a very general commitment of being at net zero by 2050, but by really developing the related paths and to show how you actually get there. That, I think, is key. We've seen quite some organizations already announcing it, such commitments, or being part of global collaborative initiatives, such as Swiss Re, for example, but we would definitely want this crowd to grow.
Okay. Shan Turnbull is very interested about the way in which you and the panel might think of indexing the degree each country becomes independent of burning carbon, and the effects on exchange rates. And a lot of people there, the ambassador opened with a comment clearly about Swiss carbon pricing and the scale of it. We've also seen in February this year the Chinese ETS being launched, Britain setting up an ETS. What opportunities do the panel think might exist for cooperation on international carbon trading between Switzerland and the UK?
Maybe I can start. I mean, Switzerland is already part of the European emission trading scheme. And we have seen encouraging developments on this level with carbon prices coming up slowly. So that will be important. But really what we always say, if we had a global proper carbon price at a completely different level from where it is now, we wouldn't have to lead many of the other discussions we lead now. So I see the linkage of existing carbon trading schemes over time as a path of how to get there. I think we will never have the global carbon price. We will have different schemes in different subsets of the economy, and we hope to link them over time and thereby approaching a global carbon price. And that I see as a promising way forward in this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would just add, if that's okay, that I think it's really important that we design emission trading schemes with net zero in mind, right? The reality is ETSs weren't designed with net zero in mind, and net zero means deep negative targets, and it means the use of carbon removal offsets that are created from burying carbon, sucking out of the atmosphere, extracting it from the atmosphere. And the UK has committed to creating a net zero aligned emissions trading scheme that creates opportunities to do that, and that's going to be really important if we're going to get these industries that that capture carbon, sequester it, use it, to get up and running. They need a cash flow, they need a price signal, and so designing ETSs in that way is going to be really important for future technologies and motivating investment. But at the moment, they're not. So I hope that the UK and Switzerland can work together to create these more ambitious emission trading schemes in the future.
Okay. We're running to the end of time, but I would like to just ask a short answer question, hopefully. I mean, one of the things I find frequently on discussions between smaller countries and larger countries is that the smaller countries are often too deferential. It's very easy to do it in a small country. I hear that in Denmark, I hear that in the Netherlands, I hear that in Ireland, I hear it in Switzerland. So I hear it a lot. And in fact, a friend of mine who lives in Zurich, James Briding, just wrote a book last year on, too small to fail, why small nations do very well. But of course, the perverse thing about this is supposedly larger countries have economies of scale. And so I'd like to ask, really inspired by Mayur Samani, who's saying, what collaborative action taken to implement ESG to the heart of everything that we do could be done. And I would love to have Claudia and Sabine tell us what we should be doing here in the UK and for Ben to react. So Claudia, you first, perhaps? What one thing would really make ESG at the heart of everything that we do?
Put a price tag on it. As soon as it comes to, you need to pay, right? In a way of like, if you don't do, you have to pay. You get. Let's say it that way. You do it, you get money back. You don't do it, you have to pay. I think with that, within seconds, you will have it. That's my hypothesis.
Music to my ears, Claudia. Music to my ears. Sabine?
Well, it's hard to beat that, but being pragmatic and knowing that this won't happen tomorrow, I think in the meantime, transparency is key. And we have to rely on some sort of responsibility of the investors. Claudia mentioned, yes, risk-return perspective is what really drives investors, but I also do see that increasingly investors just want to be part of this change, and transparency is the basis for this. So make it mandatory, not just for companies to report, but also for investors to report on not just CO2 intensity, but also other sustainability factors.
So price, responsibility. Ben, the last word is yours.
Well, I mean, I think, I think the UK and Switzerland should be working really closely together to green the global financial system, and that can take many forms. It's going to take a long time. It's critical for delivering the objectives of the Paris Agreement. It's critical for saving the planet, for preventing biodiversity loss, turning the tide. So we need to have that strategic relationship. We're two massive financial centers, two very international financial centers. We can shape the future of global finance. Let's get on and do it together.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. So price, responsible investment, and of course cooperation, which is what this series is about. Well, we've run to time, and if I may, I've got three quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, as ever, to our sponsors, both the FS Club, but also here, of course, Finance Swiss, and our lovely colleagues who we enjoyed working with here at the Embassy in London. So it's been absolutely superb. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for being there. I'd like to, in turn, clearly thank the audience. You've been superb as ever, a very informed audience. As I say, all those questions and comments will be passed on to our panelists. A reminder that, in fact, tomorrow we'll be looking in depth at the insurance industry's contributions to the climate decade with Rowan Douglas dialing in from Willis Towers Watson. But as ever, please go to the website. But my final round of thanks most certainly has to be to my panelists. All four of you have been absolutely superb and excellent, really delightful to work with. Unfortunately, technology doesn't quite allow us to get applause, so I have to bring my little applause-o-meter here. It's my Korean karmic clapper. And then I'm afraid we'll have to substitute for the audience out there. But it's been a real delight to have you, and I can clearly see over this remaining year, all the way up to COP26, and hopefully much further beyond, we're all going to be working together in that spirit of cooperation that you four so exemplified. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.